Some stories begin with violence. Some begin with fear. And some begin in the quiet moments right before the world realizes something terrible has happened. West Memphis, Arkansas. May 5, 1993. A night that would fracture a community, destroy 3 families, and create one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. They are known now as the West Memphis 3. But long before the courtrooms, the headlines, the documentaries, there was only this: a group of boys, a patch of woods, and a silence that hid more than anyone was prepared to see. The boys who never came home. In the early evening, 3 8-year-old boys left home. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, Christopher Byers. They were best friends. Second graders. Adventure in their footsteps. They entered the woods known as Robin Hood Hills, a shortcut, a playground, a place where kids dared each other to go. But that night, they didn't come back. The search. When the boys failed to return, their parents called police. Neighbors joined the search. Volunteers moved through the trees with flashlights in fear. The forest was dark, dense, full of shadows that felt heavier than usual. Nothing surfaced that night. But the morning would change everything. The discovery. May 6th, searchers walked the creek again and something caught an officer's attention. A small, mud-soaked shoe. Then another. Then clothing. Then the bodies were found submerged in the ditch. Bound. Injured. Hidden beneath water and debris. This was not accident. This was deliberate. And now the town needed answers. Fear spread fast. Facts were scarce. Rumors multiplied. People whispered, sacrifice, ritual, satanic cult. In a town already fractured by poverty, tension, and suspicion, the murders became a spark in a field of dry grass. Police needed suspects. Fast. A narrative. A direction. And that urgency created a path that would shape the next 20 years. The boys in black. Damien Echols is 18. Jason Baldwin is 16. Jessie Misskelley is 17. Teenagers known for wearing black, listening to metal, reading strange books. Different. Quiet. Outcasts. In another town that might not matter. In West Memphis, 1993. It was enough to make them suspects. Not because of evidence. Not because of behavior. But because they fit the fear. The first mistake. Jessie Misskelley, 17, IQ of 72, was brought in for questioning. He was interrogated for 12 hours. Only 46 minutes were recorded. By the end he confessed. A confession full of wrong times, wrong locations, wrong descriptions, impossible details, and yet, police accepted it. Because it fit the story they needed. And when the confession went public, fear turned into certainty. True or not, didn't matter. The legend begins. The case grew rapidly. No DNA. No eyewitness. No physical evidence. Only speculation and panic, yet the arrests came quickly. Convictions followed. The West Memphis 3 were no longer teenagers. They were villains in the eyes of the town. But the truth was far more tangled. And the real story was only beginning. Dark pause. What happened in the woods was horrifying. What happened afterward was something quieter. And in some ways even more dangerous. A rush to find answers before the evidence had time to speak. In episode 2 we'll enter the interrogation rooms, the contradictions, the forensics, the witnesses who changed stories, and the evidence that never existed. Because the West Memphis 3 case is not only a story about murder. It is a story about how justice can go wrong when fear takes control. The bodies were found. What about the truth that was still buried? Pressure in the air. Fear had already chosen its suspects. But the investigation would choose its own path. A path paved not with evidence, but with pressure. The interrogation room. On June 3, 1993, 17-year-old Jessie Misskelley walked into this room. He was not a killer. He was not violent. He was not capable of understanding what was coming next. With an IQ of 72, Jessie struggled with comprehension, memory, and pressure. Police questioned him for 12 hours. He was alone. No lawyer. No parent. No break. And only 46 minutes of the entire interrogation were ever recorded. The rest happened in silence. The kind of silence cameras never capture but pressure fills. The breakdown. Jessie's statements changed constantly. Wrong time of day, wrong location, wrong weapon, wrong sequence. Wrong descriptions. When he said the murders happened in the morning, police corrected him. When he said the boys were tied with rope, police corrected him. When he said he wasn't there, police corrected him. This wasn't a confession. It was construction. Piece by piece. A narrative built inside a room where truth didn't matter as much as conclusion. And Jessie just wanted to go home. So he said what he thought they wanted to hear. The moment everything changed. When the interrogation ended, police emerged with a confession so flawed that any careful investigator would question it. But West Memphis was not looking carefully. They were looking desperately. The confession went public. The town exhaled in relief. The pressure broke. Fear had its answer. And the three teenagers became villains overnight. Damien and Jason's turn. After Jessie's confession, police moved quickly. They arrested Damien Echols, quiet, intelligent, artistic Jason Baldwin, shy, respectful, hardworking. Their crime? Listening to metal. Wearing black. Drawing fantasy art. In a town fueled by satanic panic, these boys were symbols, not suspects. Their trial would not be based on evidence but on fear. Fear of the unfamiliar. Fear of rumors. Fear of the dark woods. And fear is a powerful witness. The evidence that never existed. What the prosecution had. No fingerprints, no ding, no blood, no fibers, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no timeline consistency. What they did have. A forced confession, a knife found in a lake months later, a satanic expert who had never met the boys, rumors, panic, assumptions, a community desperate for certainty. It was a case built on smoke and strengthened by fear. The trial begins. The courtroom became a stage. Every gesture, every look, every word was interpreted through the lens of guilt. When Damien wore black, that became evidence. When Jason looked down at the table, that became evidence. When Jessie cried, that became evidence. And the jurors did not hear the 11.5 hours that were never recorded. They only heard the final 46 minutes. The script had been written long before the trial began. The verdict was not surprising, just heartbreaking. Jessie Misskelley, life imprisonment. Jason Baldwin, life imprisonment. Damien Echols, death sentence. At just 18 years old, Damien was sent to death row. For a crime he did not commit. A crime none of them committed. A crime built from a confession that should never have existed. And the true killer walked free. Dark reflection. Some investigators chase truth. Others chase closure. But when fear controls a community, truth becomes a casualty. In episode 3, we expose the contradictions. The forensic evidence that contradicted the prosecution, the witnesses who lied, the tips police ignored, and the man many now believe was the real killer. Because the story of the West Memphis 3 is not just about wrongful conviction. It is about the darkness that grows in silence when the right questions were not asked.
The case seems solved, until a single clue shatters everything. Subscribe now, because the truth is coming.
If the confession put the boys behind bars, the forensics would begin to open the door. A case built on sand. Justice demands truth. But in West Memphis, truth never walked into the courtroom. Only pieces of it did. Pieces twisted by fear, cut by assumption, buried by urgency. This chapter is about the evidence that should have mattered but didn't. The prosecution said the murders were violent, brutal, chaotic. But the crime scene didn't match that. No blood at the scene. No blood in the creek. No dragged footprints. No disturbed brush. No broken branches. Asterisk, a crime that should have left a trail of violence. Left none. Forensic analysts were confused.
This isn't consistent with the
Some even
theory.
said
These
privately, this doesn't look like a primary crime scene. This looks like a dump site. But confusion was not welcome in the narrative. The only acceptable answer was the one people already believed. During the trial, prosecutors presented injuries as satanic mutilation. Asterisk, but years later forensic experts agreed. They were most likely animal predation. Turtles. Specifically snapping turtles. Common in the ditch. They feed on soft tissue. They leave irregular patterns. Exactly like those found on the boys' bodies. Experts tried to explain this. They were ignored. Because accepting animal predation would undermine the entire ritual theory. Fear was the foundation of the case. And foundations built on fear cannot afford cracks. The prosecution's timeline was impossible. Jessie said the murders happened at 9 a.m. The boys were in school at 9 a.m. He said it happened at noon. They were in class at noon. He said it happened near 5 p.m. Witnesses saw the boys alive. Every time Jessie guessed a time, police corrected him, guided him, shaped the confession to fit the narrative. But time does not bend. Not even for the law. The witnesses who lied. Several witnesses who claimed to have heard confessions later admitted they lied. By pressure, reward, money, desire for attention, fear of the satanic narrative, police suggestion, community influence. One man claimed Damien bragged about the murders. Years later he recanted. Another said Jason confessed to him. He recanted too. But their original testimonies stayed in the record. Stayed in the jury's mind. Stayed in the verdict. Fear makes liars out of some. Silence out of others. The real suspect no one pursued. There was someone else in the story. Someone whose name appears in documents, statements, and witness accounts. A man who arrived home covered in blood, had scratches on his arms, was acting erratic, was seen near the woods, failed a polygraph, had no alibi, threw away clothing, had a violent history, but he was never charged. Never thoroughly investigated. His name stayed in shadows while 3 teenagers were brought into the light and burned by it. To this day many believe this man was the real killer. But in 1993 no one wanted a new suspect. They wanted closure. And closure came at a terrible cost. The DNA that changed everything. Years later, when science advanced, the case was re-examined. No DNA from Damien, Jason, or Jessie was ever found at the scene. The DNA from a man related to one of the victims, a friend who was with him that night. Both were present in the woods. Both had opportunity. Both were near the boys before they disappeared. But the DNA was not strong enough to press charges. Still, it created the question prosecutors never wanted. If the convicted were innocent, then who was there? In 1993, West Memphis had its truth. Not the truth that came from evidence, but the truth that came from fear. Metal music, black clothes, teenage rebellion, In a town on edge, those things were enough to create monsters out of boys who simply felt different. Fear filled the vacuum where facts should have lived. And when a community chooses fear over reason, justice becomes collateral. Evidence should lead to truth. But in this case, truth was left in the shadows. In episode 4, we reveal the voices that refused to stay silent. The filmmakers, the private investigators, the forensic scientists, and the witnesses who finally came forward. And we follow the trail that nearly exposed the real killer. Because the West Memphis 3 were not the only victims of this crime. The truth was too. Everything the town believed was about to be questioned. And nothing would sound the same again.
They thought the silence would make the story fade. Instead, it only grew louder.
A case that refused to die. Some cases fade with time. Evidence decays. Witnesses forget. And truth disappears into dust. But the West Memphis 3 case did something else. It grew louder. It grew darker. And it grew too heavy for silence to hold. This is the episode where the world begins to look back and realize the truth was never where it was supposed to be. The documentary that changed everything. In 1996, 3 years after the convictions, 2 filmmakers, Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, arrived in West Memphis. They weren't looking for controversy. They weren't searching for innocence or guilt. They were looking for a story. What they found was a system cracking under its own weight. Their documentary, Paradise Lost, exposed what the trial tried to hide. The lack of evidence, the panic that shaped the narrative, the teenagers treated like demons, the police tunnel vision, the contradictions, the desperation for closure. The world saw the cracks, and once you see a crack, you start to wonder what else is broken. New voices, new questions. Families began speaking out. Not just the families of the convicted, but families of the victims. Some said the town was blinded by fear. Others said the investigation felt rushed. A few admitted, we didn't want to believe anyone else did it, because that would mean the real killer was still out there. Layers of grief. Layers of denial. Layers of silence that had been waiting to break. And then came the biggest crack. Forensic revelations. As technology advanced, forensic experts revisited the evidence. And what they found was devastating. The fibers used in court were not linked to the suspects. The knife that prosecutors displayed as a murder weapon was scientifically dismissed. Animal predation was confirmed by multiple forensic specialists. And most damning, DNA found at the crime scene pointed not to Damien, Jason, or Jessie, but to someone else. A man connected to one of the victims. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to make the world pause. Because DNA doesn't lie, but people do. The witnesses who broke the silence. Some witnesses said, I was pressured. I was scared. I didn't want to get involved. The police told me what they wanted. One woman who swore she overheard Damien confess recanted, saying, I lied. I wanted the reward. Another said police pushed him. They kept repeating the story until I agreed. I didn't see anything. I just said what they wanted. When truth becomes shaped by fear, memories become tools, not facts. A new suspect emerges. He came home the night of the murders covered in blood. He washed his clothes. He threw away items. He gave multiple shifting stories. Witnesses reported strange behavior. He was seen near Robin Hood Hills. A forensic examiner noted his injuries could have come from a struggle. He failed a polygraph. His alibi changed 3 times. This man was connected not to the defendants, but to one of the victims. Yet he was spared the spotlight, spared the pressure, spared the chase for answers. To this day, no charges were brought, no full investigation completed, and the question remains, did police? The world takes notice. The case became national, then international. Why? Because the world recognized a pattern. Teenagers demonized, a flawed confession, no evidence, a rush to judgment, a community in fear. Celebrities, activists, lawyers, and musicians joined the fight. Johnny Depp,
West Memphis 3.
Natalie Maines, Eddie Vedder, Peter Jackson, people with wealth, influence, and platforms began demanding answers. What started as a local tragedy became a global movement, and pressure began to squeeze the very system that created the injustice. The break in the wall. After years of appeals, years of documentaries, years of pressure, a breakthrough arrived. The Arkansas Supreme Court agreed to review the evidence. Not all of it, but enough. DNA conflicting testimonies, errors in jury selection, the flawed confession for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The system admitted something crucial. There might be a problem. And once a system admits maybe, the walls begin to crack. Damien Echols, sentenced to death, saw the first glimmer of hope since he was a teenager. Baldwin and Jessie Misskelley, serving life, finally saw a door appear in a place where there had only been walls. Truth does not rush. It does not shout. It waits in the quiet places where lies cannot survive forever. The world had begun to see the cracks. The question now was, would those cracks finally reveal the truth, or would the system find a way to seal them shut? In episode 5, we uncover the decision that changed everything. A decision that freed the West Memphis 3, but left one truth haunting every person who followed the case. Were they freed because they were innocent, or because the truth was too heavy for the system to carry? The world was finally listening. But what came next would test the truth itself. Echoes in the cell. For nearly 2 decades, the story of the West Memphis 3 lived behind bars. Damien Echols, Baldwin, Jessie Misskelley. 3 teenagers transformed into symbols of panic, of injustice, of a system that chose certainty over truth. But stories like this don't stay buried forever. Pressure builds, questions grow, and eventually, even the strongest walls crack. This is the part of the story where freedom finally came. But not the way anyone expected. The legal impossible. After years of appeals, DNA challenges, documentaries, and public pressure, the case reached a point where the state of Arkansas could no longer ignore it. Judges agreed to review key pieces. Conflicting testimonies, improper jury conduct, suppressed information, new forensic findings. For the first time, there was a real possibility of a new trial. A chance to put the evidence on the stand instead of fear. But with that possibility came risk. Because if the state lost, it would mean they were wrong from the beginning. And some systems will do anything to avoid saying those words aloud. The deal on the table. Instead of moving toward a full retrial, the state offered something else. A deal. A legal maneuver most people had never heard of, until this case. An Alford plea. Under an Alford plea, a defendant pleads guilty while maintaining innocence. They do not admit to the crime. They simply acknowledge that the state has enough evidence that a jury could convict. It is a legal paradox, a ghost of responsibility. And it came with a condition. If Damien, Jason, and Jessie accepted the plea, they would be released. If they refused, they could face years more in prison. And Damien could still face the death penalty if a new trial went wrong. Freedom, at the cost of ever being declared officially innocent. It was not justice. It was negotiation. The choices no one should have to make. For Damien, on death row, the choice carried a simple, brutal calculation. Take the deal, or risk execution. For Jason, who believed so deeply in proving their innocence, the choice was torture. Accept a plea that says, guilty, or leave Damien behind to face death alone. In the end, Jason chose his friend. He accepted the deal so Damien wouldn't die in prison. That is not what justice looks like. That is what sacrifice looks like. Jessie, who had been used from the very beginning, coerced into a confession as a teenager, now found himself again doing something unthinkable to survive. 3 lives. 3 signatures. 1 haunting question. Can you be free if the system still calls you guilty? The day they walked out. August 19, 2011. After 18 years behind bars, the West Memphis 3 walked out of prison. No retrial. No exoneration. No "we're sorry" from the state. They walked out not as men declared innocent, but as men released on a legal technicality that still branded them as guilty on paper. Outside, cameras flashed. Supporters cried. Reporters shouted questions. Damien looked thin. Jason looked stunned. Jessie looked overwhelmed. Freedom did not feel clean. It felt complicated. It felt unfinished. Because this was not a victory. It was an escape. The families left in the middle. There is another part of this story that cannot be ignored. The families of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. 3 children who never came home. 3 families who lost more than anyone. Some believe the West Memphis 3 are innocent. Some do not. Some feel robbed, as if the deal took away their chance to ever see a true trial with all the evidence laid bare. Others quietly admit that doubt has grown. That the men they once believed were monsters might not be the ones who took their sons. Grief does not care about legal terms. It only knows absence. And in West Memphis, the absence never left. Not from the woods. Not from the homes. Not from the empty chairs at the table. The real killer still a shadow. If the West Memphis 3 did not do it, and a mountain of evidence suggests they did not, then someone else did. Somewhere there is a person who knew the boys, was in the area, left intangible traces, walked away in the dark, watched the town collapse on the wrong suspects. That person has never been convicted. Maybe never been questioned properly. Maybe watched the documentaries, read the articles, lived a life uninterrupted. The law closed the case, but the truth never did. The price of being free but not cleaned. Today, Damien, Jason, and Jessie live outside prison walls. But the label convicted still sits on their records. It affects jobs. It shapes interviews. It lingers in articles and databases. They are free but not exonerated. Saved but not cleared. They gained years. They lost innocence in the eyes of the law. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. To escape a system that wronged them, they had to agree, legally, to the version of events that system created. Some call that a compromise. Others call it another layer of injustice. What remains? 3 boys were murdered in 1993. Their names were Stevie, Michael, and Christopher. 3 teenagers were convicted. Their names were Damien, Jason, and Jessie. 3 men walked out of prison nearly 20 years later with their lives, but not their justice. And somewhere between those 6 names lies a truth that has still never fully come to light. Some stories end with clean answers. This is not one of them. This story ends with a question that refuses to disappear. If justice is supposed to bring truth to the surface, what do we call it when the truth is left behind? In memory of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. Thank you for not letting this story go quiet. The story didn't end with their release. It simply moved into the shadows.